Alone in the Dark, 1992. It's all well and good talking about classics like Resident Evil and Silent Hill. But those games only existed because Alone in the Dark proved it was possible. A game so old the name has basically entered gaming lexicon, and most gamers don't even know what it is. Inspired by H.P. Lovecraft horror and rocking some pretty impressive graphics for the time. Right from the get-go, the attention to the spooky set pieces and cinematic detail grabbed you by the throat. A like, or better yet a subscribe, is literally the currency that allows YouTube to pay me, so a little click from you is a massive win for me. Thank you so much. You'd play as either Edward Carnby or Emily Hartwood, although it was mostly Carnby who was featured in the artwork. Absolutely seeped in the very best of Lovecraft's turn-of-the-century atmosphere, specifically 1924 in this case, Carnby puts on his best shirt.
I slipped into my best shirt,
holsters his .38,
holstered my .38,
and makes his way to the DeSoto mansion deep within Louisiana, where he's to investigate the death of its former owner, who hung himself in the attic. The action is head-shakingly basic at times, and makes Resident Evil's aiming system comparable to a surgeon's blade. But it shouldn't come as a surprise that this game was neither praised for nor built on the action. It was the atmosphere that for the first time could be experienced in a fully rendered 3D environment that in essence was a simple maze filled with puzzles, masquerading as a large house. The irony being, of course, that this is exactly what it was in-game, a classic haunted mansion filled with secrets that needed uncovering, monsters that needed besting, and a somewhat terrifying secret that needed putting to rest. From bedrooms with four-poster beds, to bathrooms with old-fashioned rope pulls and towels flung over rails, the house felt real and lived in, but also felt truly haunted, not just by zombies and monsters, but also spirits that told a story that would spell intrigue and leave you wondering what on earth had caused all of this to happen, which of course is the very essence of a horror mystery. Personally though, my favourite element of the game that stuck with me 30 years later was the fact that when you had no weapons in hand, Carnby would straight up smack a motherfucking zombie in the face. I'm not sure if it was just me, but even as a kid, I felt there was no better way to dissipate the horror than to have a moustached, waistcoat-wearing private eye trading blows with a zombie. With his trademark kidney kick that would take a second or two to wind up, to well-aimed chin jabs that he would literally use to beat a zombie into submission. I mean, this was the age when everybody boxed, so I guess it's kind of believable. He was just such a freaking baller. I loved Carnby. I got to experience my first horror game through him, and I felt he was well suited to the task. And my sister, who played as Emily Hartwood, spent years saying the same about her. And I confess, creepy clown face aside, seeing those high kicks in action, I can see why. The game honestly had it all, from light-hearted moments to seriously creepy things you'd happen across that would leave you tense and ready for a jump scare, to actual jump scares, to a whimsical backing track matched to chilling sound effects like the ever-present creaking doors. Remember that this game had very little to base itself on, and so it was impressive that so many of these elements are still things that we see to this day. With that in mind, it was the trademark fixed camera angles, the pre-rendered backgrounds, the genuinely suspenseful story that progressed at a decent pace as long as you kept following the clues, increasingly powerful enemies that could be combated with increasingly powerful weapons, the caverns found beneath the mansion in the final chapters, a dark truth hidden within the depths, and even the mad dash for the exit as the place started to self-destruct, that would ultimately all become associated with Resident Evil, the most prolific titan of survival horror today, with the director Shinji Mikami himself always being open about where the influence came from. As was normal for the time, it was just a single year before a sequel hit the shelves in 1993. Carnby was back in action, following the steps of his dead partner in a kidnapping case that leads him into conflict with centuries-old pirates and a child-sacrificing witch. Despite the action being the first game's weakest aspect, they chose to dial it up without actually improving it, as well as introducing a sizable slice of comedy, both of which really worked against it. The backdrop of the narrative was, again, an extravagant mansion, this time sitting above a cursed pirate ship all of which was well fleshed out with a solid narrative, great set pieces, and a really impressive score, but the over-reliance on combat shone too much light on the game's shortcomings. A third outing 2 years later in 1995 moved the setting to the Mojave Desert in California, and had Carnby hunting for Emily Hartwood from the first game on the set of a western. The crew were missing, supernatural mysteries were reported, and Carnby was sent in. This entry saw a return to the survival horror roots set down by the first, with less action and more investigation, and intriguing story notes like radioactive mutation and shuffling zombies running amok. As original as it was, the following year in 1996, Resident Evil would blow the world away, establishing rogue scientists and insidious corporations as the new crowd favourite, pushing both Lovecraft and the 1920s Carnby straight into the archives. And then, in 2001, competing directly with the fourth Resident Evil title, Code Veronica, the tragically underrated Alone in the Dark: The New Nightmare appeared, with a modern Carnby teaming up with a university professor called Aline Cedric to provide two concurrent plots that were basically two playthroughs, shamelessly dubbed by some as a Resident Evil clone, an irony that serves to really be its undoing. We actually saw the first modern update of Carnby in an era that was just about old enough to retain some of that old world gothic vibe, before electronic communications and the internet and so on really modernized the world. It was extremely well received by critics and fans, but by relinquishing its biggest selling point, that being the hard-boiled detective fiction of 1920s merged with supernatural horror, which is pretty much the Lovecraftian mainstay, it simply didn't do enough to stand apart from Capcom's dominating franchise. Now, the less said about Atari's absolute cluster screw of 2008 better, but suffice it to say the developers attempted to shove every gameplay mechanic that they could into the most convoluted story perhaps ever seen in video game history. The combat sucks, the shooting sucks, the driving sucks, the atmosphere and the horror were non-existent. The back and forward plot had something to do with end of days or whatever, and it sucked. The ending was laughable.
I'm the light bringer. I'm the fucking universe.
In fact, the whole game was laughable. It was so bad, I can't even tell you, and it pretty much destroyed the entire franchise, with some saying it was one of the worst games ever made. And then, in 2015, they were proven wrong, with Alone in the Dark: Illumination, a game so bad that YouTubers had to start re-releasing their top 10 worst games list just to slot it in. A 4-player survival shooter styled on Left 4 Dead, called Alone in the Dark. Need I say more? No connection to the original story. This soulless glitch fest was so abysmal that it obliterated any shred of integrity that the household name of Alone in the Dark had left. Suffice it to say, the developers caught lightning in a bottle with the original, on par with Doom in regards to its impact that defined an entire genre, going on to inspire a generation of game makers like those at Capcom and Konami to establish their own brands that are still running to this day. 2024 will see the fairly unknown developer Pieces Interactive bringing the franchise back to its roots under the guiding hand of THQ Nordic. But considering how far from the path this much-loved classic has strayed, it's unlikely gamers will be holding their breaths. Nevertheless, the right notes are being played, so let's hope that this much-loved classic gets the updates to the modern era that it very much deserves.